In the autumn of 1832, in a small, wind-bitten village called Low Moorsley in County Durham, England, a girl was born who would one day become the most prolific female murderer in British history. Her name was Mary Ann Cotton, though the world would not know that name, or fear it, for several decades yet. Low Moorsley was not a place that made headlines. It was a working-class hamlet carved out of the northeastern English countryside, the kind of place where soot settled into everything, into the walls, into the clothes, into the lungs of the men who worked beneath the earth. Coal mining was the lifeblood of communities like this one, and the Cotton family was no exception to that rule. Mary's father, Michael Robson, was a miner, young, poor, and earnest, who had married her mother, Margaret, when both of them were barely out of childhood themselves. They were hopeful people in a hopeless kind of landscape, and for a time, that hope was enough. Mary Ann arrived into this world as their firstborn, small and quiet, with no visible shadow yet darkening her story. Mary Ann grew up in the rhythms of a miner's household, the early mornings, the long silences, the prayers offered up against disaster. When she was around 8 years old, the family uprooted themselves and moved to Merton, another colliery village not far away, seeking better wages and steadier work. For young Mary Ann and her brother Robert, the move was disorienting. Children's friendships, even in small towns, are deeply rooted, and being transplanted into a new place where nobody knew your name could be quietly devastating. Mary Ann struggled to find her footing socially, to locate the joy that had perhaps existed more easily in the familiar streets of Low Moorsley. But those social difficulties were about to become the least of her concerns. Before long, tragedy arrived in the most permanent of forms. Her father, Michael Robson, fell to his death in a mining accident. The exact circumstances vary in historical accounts, but the fact remains: the man who had been the anchor of their small family was suddenly, violently gone. Mary Ann was still a young girl when she learned the first and most brutal lesson of her world. The people you love can be taken from you without warning, and life simply continues on regardless. Widowhood in Victorian England was not a luxury. For a working-class woman with children to feed, remarriage was less a romantic decision and more a matter of economic survival. Mary Ann's mother, Margaret, understood this reality with painful clarity, and so she remarried. Her new husband was a man named George Stott, a stepfather who would enter the lives of Mary Ann and Robert with all the disruptive force of a stranger claiming authority over a household that had already been broken once. Historical records suggest that Stott was a strict man, disciplinarian in his approach, the kind of presence that fills a home with tension rather than warmth. For Mary Ann, now entering her teenage years and already shaped by grief and displacement, his arrival was deeply unwelcome. She did not warm to him. The dynamic was cold and combative from the start. Yet there was, in fairness, a practical upside. Stott earned a steady income, and his wages brought material comforts the family had not previously enjoyed: better food, better clothing, perhaps a modest improvement in domestic life. Mary Ann, sharp-eyed and pragmatic even as a teenager, noticed this. She noticed that money made the hardness of life more bearable. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her days. By the time Mary Ann was 16, the tension in the Stott household had reached a breaking point. Whether it was Stott's discipline, the general suffocation of a rigid domestic life, or simply the restlessness of a young woman who sensed that the world was wider than her stepfather's rules allowed, she left. She walked away from that household and took up work as a domestic servant on a farm in the village of South Hetton. It was hard, unglamorous work, and it offered no glamour, no adventure, but it offered distance, and distance was exactly what she needed. After 3 years of farm service, Mary Ann's ambitions shifted. She wanted something different, something that required skill, something with a degree of independence baked into it. She apprenticed herself to a dressmaker, learning the trade of the seamstress with the same quiet determination that she seemed to apply to everything in her life. She had a practical intelligence that was difficult to dismiss. She was also, by the accounts of those who knew her at the time, a woman of considerable physical appeal. Dark-haired, sharp-featured, and possessed of a certain magnetic quality that drew people toward her. She was about to use that quality in ways that would define her entire life. In 1852, at the age of approximately 19, Mary Ann married for the first time. Her husband was William Mowbray, a collier, another miner, unsurprisingly, given the geography of her world. He was also, when the occasion demanded it, a railway laborer, willing to turn his hands to whatever work kept the household running. The early years of the marriage were itinerant ones, the couple moving from town to town across the north and southwest of England as Mowbray chased employment. This was not unusual in mid-Victorian working-class life. Entire communities moved in waves with the shifting demands of industry, and families like the Mowbrays were caught up in those waves. What was unusual, or should have been, was what happened to their children. In the space of their first 5 years together, Mary Ann bore 5 children, and 4 of them died. Infant mortality in Victorian England was, it must be said, shockingly high by modern standards. Disease, malnutrition, and the general precariousness of working-class life claimed enormous numbers of young children every year. Families routinely buried children, and they grieved and they carried on. But even against that grim backdrop, the losses accumulating around Mary Ann were beginning to form a pattern.
Let us be precise about what high infant mortality actually meant in Victorian England, because precision matters here. Yes, children died. Yes, infections that are now routinely treated could then be fatal. Yes, the poor were particularly vulnerable. But even within that context, the rate at which children in Mary Ann's immediate orbit were dying was statistically remarkable. Investigators and historians who have examined her life in detail note that the deaths tended to cluster around her, that wherever she settled, the gravedigger soon had work to do. When the Mowbray family eventually settled back in County Durham, the pattern continued. William Mowbray himself died in January 1865, supposedly of an intestinal disorder. Before his body was cold, Mary Ann had collected on his life insurance policy, a detail that would later take on enormous significance. Life insurance was a relatively new concept in mid-Victorian England, but it had taken hold with remarkable speed among the working class, who understood that the death of a breadwinner could mean immediate destitution. Mary Ann understood this too, with what we might now recognize as particular clarity. She had insured William, she had insured the children, and she was beginning to seem, in retrospect, a great deal less like an unfortunate widow, and a great deal more like something else entirely. Following William Mowbray's death, Mary Ann did not grieve for long. She moved quickly into the household of a man named George Ward, whom she married in 1865. Ward was a patient at a hospital where Mary Ann had briefly worked as a nurse. Their marriage lasted just over a year before George Ward died, reportedly of a stomach ailment that his doctors found difficult to diagnose. Mary Ann collected what she could and moved on. Her third marriage was to a man named James Robinson, a shipwright from Sunderland, and it was with Robinson that she began to raise another set of children, some hers, some his. Robinson was, by most accounts, a decent man who genuinely cared for Mary Ann, and he was perhaps the one significant relationship in her adult life that did not end in death. He survived. But the people around them did not always share his luck. Mary Ann's mother, who had come to live with the household while ill, died within 9 days of arriving. Robinson's children from his previous marriage began to die in rapid succession. Mary Ann's own surviving children from her earlier marriages also died during this period. Robinson, who was not without intelligence, refused to allow Mary Ann to insure his life. He eventually threw her out. Thrown out of the Robinson household, possibly the one home in her adult life where she might have settled into something resembling normalcy, Mary Ann moved again. She was nothing if not adaptable. Around 1870, she encountered Frederick Cotton, a widower with children of his own, and began a relationship with him. There was a complication. She was still legally married to James Robinson, as no divorce had been obtained. She married Frederick Cotton anyway, bigamously, in 1870. It was her fourth marriage, though only 3 of them were legal. Frederick Cotton, like the men before him, did not live long after marrying Mary Ann. He died in 1871, and his life had been insured. His children, her stepchildren, began dying too, one by one, their deaths attributed to gastric fever, to bowel complaints, to the vague intestinal miseries that Victorian medicine often struggled to parse. The insurance money flowed steadily, quietly, into Mary Ann's hands. She was not wealthy. She was not extravagant. She was surviving, maneuvering through the economics of poverty with a ruthlessness that the system around her had, in some sense, made necessary, even if her methods went far beyond anything necessity could justify. In 1872, in the village of West Auckland, County Durham, Mary Ann Cotton was living with her last surviving stepson, a boy named Charles Edward Cotton, who was around 7 years old. She was also involved with a man named Quick Manning, a local excise officer, and she wanted to be free to pursue that relationship without the encumbrance of a child who was not hers by blood and who represented, perhaps, nothing more to her than an inconvenience and an ongoing expense. She spoke to a local official, a man named Thomas Riley, and suggested that Charles Edward might need to be sent to the workhouse. Riley refused, observing that Mary Ann herself could take care of the boy. His refusal was offhand, bureaucratic, but he noticed something in the way she spoke about the child, a coldness, a calculation that unsettled him. Within days of that conversation, Charles Edward Cotton was dead. Riley, disturbed by the timing, went to the authorities. A local doctor had initially attributed the death to natural causes, but Riley's insistence prompted a more careful examination. When the contents of Charles Edward's stomach were analyzed, the result was unambiguous. The boy had been poisoned with arsenic. Arsenic was, in the Victorian era, a poisoner's most reliable ally. It was readily available, sold openly in pharmacies and general stores, used in rat poison, in dyes, in wallpaper pigment, in a dozen household products. It was cheap, it was odorless, it was tasteless when dissolved in liquid, and crucially, its symptoms, vomiting, stomach cramps, diarrhea, progressive weakness, mimicked those of cholera, gastroenteritis, and the many other intestinal illnesses that were simply facts of Victorian life. A doctor examining a victim of arsenic poisoning in 1870 had no particular reason to suspect foul play. The symptoms pointed, convincingly, to natural disease. This is almost certainly why Mary Ann Cotton was able to operate for as long as she did. Each death, taken individually, was plausible. Gastric fever, bowel obstruction, intestinal inflammation. The diagnoses were consistent with the era, with the poverty of the community she moved through, with the genuine suffering of working-class bodies in industrial England. It was only when you stepped back and looked at the full picture, at the extraordinary number of people who had died in her immediate vicinity, all of similar causes, all insured, that the shape of something monstrous began to emerge from the fog of medical plausibility. Mary Ann Cotton was arrested in July 1872, following the discovery of arsenic in the body of young Charles Edward. The investigation that followed was not a simple one. The evidence was circumstantial in many respects, and the technology of forensic science in 1872 was primitive by modern standards. But what investigators lacked in sophistication, they compensated for in persistence. Bodies were exhumed. Stomachs were tested. The same signature emerged again and again: arsenic. The scale of what they were uncovering slowly became apparent to the investigators, though even they could not be entirely certain how many victims there had been. Mary Ann had lived in many places, married many men, buried many children. Not all of those deaths had been documented in ways that made posthumous examination straightforward. The official charge when it came to trial in March 1873 focused on the murder of Charles Edward Cotton, the most recent death, the one for which the evidence was strongest. But the shadow of the other deaths loomed over the courtroom regardless. The press had already made Mary Ann Cotton infamous. Newspapers across England had run her story, piecing together the years of loss and insurance payouts with an enthusiasm that was part moral outrage and part morbid fascination.
The trial of Mary Ann Cotton opened at Durham Assizes on March 5, 1873, and it drew enormous public attention. She had become, in the months between her arrest and her trial, one of the most notorious figures in England, a subject of horror, of grim curiosity, of a particular Victorian anxiety about women who stepped outside the prescribed boundaries of femininity. The angel in the house was the ideal of the era, the self-sacrificing wife and mother whose entire existence was devoted to the comfort and welfare of her family. Mary Ann Cotton was the nightmare inversion of that ideal. She had turned the domestic space, the home, the hearth, the kitchen, into a killing ground. She had used the most intimate forms of care, feeding, nursing, cooking, as methods of murder. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning a verdict of guilty. The judge donned the black cap and sentenced her to death. Throughout the trial, Mary Ann had maintained a kind of stubborn composure, insisting on her innocence with a persistence that impressed some observers and infuriated others. She was, to the end, a difficult woman to read, opaque, self-contained, and utterly unwilling to perform the remorse that Victorian society demanded of condemned women.
Mary Ann Cotton was executed on March 24, 1873, at Durham County Gaol. She was 40 years old. The execution did not go smoothly. The hangman, a man named William Calcraft, was known for his imprecision, and on this occasion he miscalculated the drop. Rather than dying instantly from a broken neck, the intended mercy of the long drop method, Mary Ann Cotton died slowly, by strangulation, in full view of the witnesses assembled in the prison yard. It was a grim end, even by the standards of public execution, and it was noted in the press with the same lurid attention that had followed her throughout her trial. The crowd outside the prison walls, for crowds still gathered for executions, even when they were no longer fully public, received the news of her death with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. She had been judged, she had been condemned, she had been killed. The machine of Victorian justice had run its course, but the questions she left behind were not so easily dispatched. How many had she really killed? What had driven her? Was she a monster born, or a monster made by the brutal economics of the world she had inhabited?
The official count of murders for which Mary Ann Cotton was formally prosecuted was 1, the death of Charles Edward Cotton. But historians and criminologists who have examined her life in detail believe the true figure is dramatically higher. The most commonly cited estimate is that Mary Ann poisoned somewhere between 15 and 21 people over the course of approximately 20 years, from the early 1850s through to 1872. The victims included 4 husbands, a lover, her own mother, at least 1 friend, and an unknown number of children, both her biological offspring and the stepchildren who passed through her various households. The difficulty in establishing a precise number lies in the incompleteness of Victorian record-keeping, in the fact that many of the deaths occurred before forensic toxicology was sufficiently developed to identify poisoning after the fact, and in the simple passage of time. Some bodies were never exhumed. Some deaths were never investigated. Some of the people Mary Ann Cotton killed simply slipped into the anonymity of Victorian working-class mortality, their ends recorded as fever or gastritis, or the catch-all diagnosis of natural causes, and forgotten. The insurance money she accumulated across these decades was never enormous, but it was consistent, and it was the consistent thread linking nearly every death. Why did she do it? This is the question that has fascinated true crime writers, historians, and psychologists for a century and a half, and it resists a simple answer. The most immediate motive was financial. Mary Ann Cotton lived in genuine poverty for most of her life, in a society that offered working-class women almost no legitimate avenues to economic independence. Widowhood plus life insurance was, in that context, one of the very few mechanisms by which a woman like her could accumulate any capital at all. She killed, in this reading, because it worked, because it solved the immediate problem of survival, of debt, of dependency on men whose earnings she could not control. But financial gain alone feels insufficient as an explanation for the full scope of what she did. She killed children who generated no insurance payout. She killed her own mother. She appears to have killed people who were, in practical terms, more useful to her alive than dead. Some researchers have suggested a more psychological explanation, that Mary Ann Cotton experienced other human beings, including her own children, primarily as instruments, as sources of either utility or inconvenience, and that she eliminated them when the balance tipped toward inconvenience, with a chilling emotional detachment that might, in modern diagnostic language, suggest psychopathy. The Victorian press turned Mary Ann Cotton into a cautionary figure of almost mythological proportions. She appeared in broadsides and pamphlets, in penny dreadfuls and newspaper columns, as the embodiment of every fear that respectable Victorian society harbored about women who operated outside the domestic ideal. She was the poisoner, the widow, the bad mother, a figure who had inverted every virtue that the era prized. Children in County Durham reportedly sung a skipping rhyme about her for years after her death. Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten. She lies in her bed with her eyes wide open. Sing, sing, oh what can I sing? Mary Ann Cotton is tied up with string. It is a disturbing artifact of folk memory, a child's rhyme about a murderer, passed down through generations in the communities where she had lived and killed. It speaks to the depth of the impression she left, to the way her story embedded itself into the local consciousness of Northeast England. She was not a distant villain or an abstract threat. She had lived among these people. She had been a neighbor, a wife, a mother, and she had turned all of those roles into instruments of death.
Mary Ann Cotton occupies a specific and significant place in the history of crime. She is widely considered the first serial killer in British history to have been convicted, though the term serial killer would not be coined for another century. She predates Jack the Ripper by nearly 2 decades, yet receives a fraction of the cultural attention. This disparity is itself worth noting. The Ripper, whose victims were killed in the streets by an unknown hand, has generated an entire industry of books, films, documentaries, and tours. Mary Ann Cotton, who killed more people over a longer period with greater premeditation, remains a more obscure figure outside of true crime circles and Northern English local history. Some scholars have suggested that this disparity reflects a gendered bias in how we remember killers, that the spectacular, mysterious male murderer commands cultural attention in a way the methodical, domestic female one does not. Others suggest that the Ripper's unresolved identity carries a narrative tension that Cotton's story, which ended in a conviction and an execution, simply cannot match. Either way, her historical significance is beyond dispute. She exposed the vulnerabilities in Victorian forensic medicine, in life insurance regulation, and in the systems that were supposed to protect the vulnerable. Before we close this chapter of history, it is worth pausing on the people Mary Ann Cotton killed, because they are in danger of being reduced to props in her story, to numbers in a tally, to footnotes in the biography of a murderer. William Mowbray loved her enough to marry her and travel the country with her, trying to build a life from the unpromising materials that industrial England provided. His children, their children, lived for months or years, were held and named and presumably loved by someone before they died in their beds, with their small bodies full of poison. George Ward survived sickness and found, briefly, the comfort of a wife. James Robinson's children from his first marriage had already lost their mother before Mary Ann entered their lives. Frederick Cotton's children had no say in any of it. And Charles Edward Cotton, the 7-year-old boy whose death finally brought the whole edifice crashing down, had done nothing except exist in a household where his existence was inconvenient. These were real people, with real claims on our historical empathy. The story of Mary Ann Cotton is ultimately not a...
The case of Mary Ann Cotton forced a reckoning with several systemic vulnerabilities that Victorian society had largely ignored. The ease with which arsenic could be purchased was one. In the years following her conviction, and in response to a broader pattern of arsenic poisonings that her case had thrown into sharp relief, regulations around the sale of arsenic were significantly tightened in Britain. The Arsenic Act, combined with increasing pharmaceutical controls, made it considerably harder for would-be poisoners to simply walk into a shop and buy a killing agent over the counter. The development of forensic toxicology also accelerated in this period, as the medical establishment grappled with the reality that the symptoms of poisoning had been misread for years as the symptoms of natural disease. The James Marsh test for arsenic detection, developed in the 1830s, became more widely applied in suspicious death investigations after cases like Cotton's demonstrated what the failure to apply it could cost. Insurance regulation, too, came under scrutiny. The ease with which Mary Ann had insured and reinsured the people around her pointed to a system that had developed no safeguards against exactly this kind of predation. These were hard lessons, paid for in lives.
Mary Ann Cotton died on a cold March morning in 1873, strangling at the end of a rope in Durham jail, and the world that had made her, the world of poverty and coal dust and infant death, and women with no options, and men who held all the economic power, continued on without her. That world has changed enormously in the century and a half since her execution. Life insurance is regulated. Arsenic is controlled. Forensic science can detect poisons in bodies exhumed after decades. The systemic vulnerabilities she exploited have been, for the most part, closed. But Mary Ann Cotton remains in the historical record, in the skipping rhymes of Durham children, in the true crime books and podcasts and documentaries that return to her story again and again, drawn by the same morbid gravity that drew Victorian newspaper readers. She is a mirror, and what she reflects is not simply a single individual woman's evil, but a whole society's failures. Its failures to see what was happening in the homes of the poor, to protect children who had no voice, to ask the questions that might have saved 20 lives. She is a warning. She is a ghost, and she has not finished haunting us yet.
If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt. Before you go, thank you for staying until the very end. In a world of endless scrolling and short attention spans, you chose to spend this time exploring real human stories. That means more than you know. If these stories moved you, made you think, or helped you see the world a little differently, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It's the best way to support this channel and make sure more stories like these continue to be told. And if one of these stories stayed with you after the video ended, share it with someone you care about. One message, one repost can help these voices reach someone who needs to hear them. Leave a comment and tell me which story touched you the most. I read every one. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, and your heart. I'll see you in the next story. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt.